Hey, Connexus Church, Mark Clark here. So good to be with you during this series, during the month of July. Man, it is a privilege to be talking to you in this series called Verses. And the concept is, the idea is, one idea versus another idea. As we process for our own worldview, for our own lives, for our own thinking, how does this idea versus that idea actually play out? And which one is better than the other in the marketplace of ideas? And so such a privilege to be exploring all of the things we're going to be talking about in the next 4 weeks. If you have a Bible, open up to Romans chapter 1. That's where we're going to be for this particular first message of this 4-week series. And we're going to be talking about faith versus reason. And man, I'm just excited to be part of this with you. You are actually, don't tell my own church, Village Church, but you're my favorite church, Connexus Church. I love hanging with you guys. I love Jeff. I love Carrie. I love all your pastors. It's such a blast to be hanging for this series even and just talking about these ideas, exploring these ideas, because we really believe, if you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, maybe you're of another religion and you're watching this, awesome. We're glad that you're part of Connexus Church on this journey with us because we really want to believe the best ideas. What are the best ideas in the marketplace of ideas? I didn't grow up as a Christian. And so you got to understand that right off the bat. My dad was so adamantly atheistic. Like no church, no family, no church, no Bible, no prayer, no anything. Didn't want that for our family at all. And so he actually, my brother's name is Matthew. He's a few years older than me, and they named him Matthew. But my dad said you couldn't spell his name with one T, or you had to spell it with one T, because he didn't want to spell it with two T's, which is how the Bible spells it, because to spell it with two T's would mean that my family was being biblical. And so my mom had to spell it. So my brother's driver's license, Matthew with one T. 4 years later, they had me and called me Mark. All right. So the irony in that, he wouldn't have even picked up on the fact, like if I had a brother, he'd probably call him Luke. All right. That's literally what my family was like. So I had no exposure. So the first time I ever heard of faith or Christianity or God, I thought it was for dumb people, which is what we're talking about today. Faith versus reason. I thought dumb. So you've seen it on the news. You turn on the news, there's one really smart, awesome professor from Britain with a PhD from Oxford. He's like, and they're representing atheism or agnosticism or naturalism or whatever, science. And they're like, oh yes, I should tell you, we're going to debate right now and I'm going to tell you all things about it. And then they're like, and then our second guest representing faith, representing Christianity is Joe. Joe lives in a swamp and thinks Oprah's the Antichrist, all right? And you're like, okay, I'm going to choose the professor because it's the false dichotomy. And that's my first thing to you today is it really is a false dichotomy to think about faith or reason. We've got to understand that as people have delved into Christianity, actual reason is the reason that they've come to faith in Jesus. Listen to Romans chapter 1. All right, this is a New Testament book written by a guy named Paul, and he says these words, chapter 1, verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, meaning people, because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. And so here's what you got to understand. God builds his own evidence into creation and asks us to go mine it. Science has never been against faith. It has actually grown out of the matrix of faith, specifically of Christianity. So when I first became a Christian, 19, I went to church, and I actually was a person, I'm an evidential thinker, so I only believe something if I have evidence to believe it, and I've always been like that. And I remember first going to church, and I would come home for dinner, my family would look at me, and they'd laugh, and they'd say, you're part of a cult, you're part of a group of people who doesn't believe in reason, and you just believe, or science, you just believe in this crazy Bible book or whatever. And I'd be like, no. It's actually rational, it's historical, it's philosophical, it's psychological. I've done the work because I believe, as Christianity has always believed, you got to run the ramp of reason before taking the leap of faith. And maybe that's you. That's what this series is about, and that's what Christianity presents. Look at the evidence built into creation and deduce things about God. Don't just sit and airy-fairy look around and go, I think I'm going to believe stuff about God that I just want to believe. And I remember looking at my family and going, no, it's based on reason. They'd say, no, you're part of a cult. And I'd say, no. And they'd say, what did you do today? And I'd be like, well, I drank the blood and ate the flesh of a dead man. But okay, that sounds crazy. I get it. But you got to understand these are rational, reasonable people, because the Bible, you know that the university was a 12th century Christian invention, right? Harvard, Brown, Princeton, all of these universities were built out of the matrix, out of Christianity. Because there's certain things about, and that's the first thing I want you to hear, is that our modern scientific realities, our scientific method, our scientific deductions and conclusions grow out of a Christian matrix, a theistic view of the world, meaning that if you put something through a scientific method, it's observable, the creation is unified, it's repeatable, it has design and order, so you can repeat different hypotheses, observation, verification, whereas other worldviews weren't allowing people to go down that route. So animism, for instance, where the spirits and the gods were actually in the water and in the trees, well, you can't do experiments on them because you're going to hurt the gods. Why was there a storm last weekend in the sea? Why? Well, because Poseidon was angry. That's what all the different worldviews talk about. And yet Christianity comes along and goes, no. There's actually temperatures, and so they were doing what Paul talks about in Romans 1. You're actually delving into creation itself in order to deduce things. So that's issue number one. Christians believe in reason. We want to run down the ramp of reason in order to establish what we're going to believe about faith. Because faith, everybody has a faith position. That's what you've got to understand. Every single person has a faith position. The only question is what you fill that faith position with. I took my wife just before our first daughter. We went to the island of Victoria for our kind of baby moon, they call it, the honeymoon you go away on before you have your baby because you're not going to touch each other for the next 6 months. All right, so that thing, so we went away to Victoria and first baby. And I remember didn't have any money, and I was like, okay, how do we find this hotel? And I found this cheap hotel, but it was somewhat nice on the outside, so we got into it, and I'm like, hey, and they gave me the key, and we went up the elevator, and the elevator doors opened, and there was two sides looking out. There was one side that was just like beat up old paint, and then the other side is beautiful wallpaper that they were like redoing, and I was like, oh man, I hope I'm going right. And I looked down at my key, and it's like an old shaggy key, and I'm like, uh-oh, and we were going left. And we went down and it was all, turned over and like lights swinging, whatever. And we go into this room and it's literally one of those old televisions with like the rabbit ears popping out that you got to kind of go like this to get a, whatever. The bed hadn't been touched since the 70s, shag orange carpet, dust everywhere. And I opened up the window and there was literally a brick wall 2 feet from us. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I remember thinking, listen, everything has a window. You have a window even if you're not a believer. Everybody has a window. The question is, what does the window look out on? What is the content of your faith? Because everyone has a faith position. In fact, there was a nurse friend of mine who goes to our church, and she was telling me that they were in the hospital and they had to make a decision about pulling the plug on a patient one day, and they were looking at this patient saying, I don't think they're going to make it, and they're suffering right now. And so what was really important was no religious worldview was allowed to inform any decisions at the hospital. And so they had all these discussions, and the nurses and doctors, and they pulled the plug. And then they were sitting around later, and one of the doctors said, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. And right there, the nurse realized that was a faith position. That was a statement about metaphysics, or what's called meta, meaning after physics. How do you know, she thought to herself, what happens in the afterlife? You don't have any proof of what might go on. How do you know that person's not suffering more than they were? See, every time that you say something like that, you're showing your faith position. It's just not based on any information. And so every person has a faith position. The question is, what's the one that lines up most with the evidence? And what the Bible's saying is, I want you to delve into the evidence of creation, of history, of philosophy, in order to have an informed faith that actually lines up with the questions of origin, meanings, morality, and destiny. And if you can grab a hold of those and realize that the best answers are on the person and the work of Jesus, then you've got a worldview that doesn't contradict itself and thus need to be abandoned. Like most worldviews, certainly like atheistic worldviews or agnostic worldviews. So issue number one is that we understand that it's biblical to actually look into reason and rationale. It's not a dichotomy. It's not against faith. Faith grows out of reason. Number two, We realize the more science has delved into their disciplines, whether it's astronomy or biology or history, that there's more rational reasons to believe in God now than there ever have been. The more we look into the data, the more we realize there are justifiable reasons to believe in God. I'll give you an example. You look at men like John Polkinghorne, John Lennox, Francis Collins. These are like professors at Oxford, writers, scientists. Years ago, a guy named Quentin Smith wrote a book. He's an agnostic philosopher. And he wrote in an article, he said, the field of philosophy is being desecularized across universities in America. 1/4 to 1/3 of the philosophy departments now consists of theists, generally Christians. And he was saying, I don't like this idea. I'm not a fan of it. He said it became almost overnight academically respectable to argue for theism. And he cited the work of one particular guy named Alvin Plantinga, who is said to be the greatest living philosopher alive today, and he's a Christian. He's a theist, and he believes it's only rational philosophically to believe most of what we believe if you posit a God in the midst of it. So here's what's happened. The deeper science has delved into not just, we've gone beyond observational science, right? So observational science was the stuff of like Darwin, where you would look at, wings and bones and be able to look in the outside and tear open and look through a microscope and whatever, and be able to now we're looking at quarks and cells and DNA strands and dark matter. And these things are all showing us the universe is far more complex than we thought. DNA strands have a language embedded in them that calls out for a mind. We're not just looking at birds, cutting them open, going, okay, it looks like they're connected to this, which we'll talk about the details of next week when we hit the issue of evolution versus creation. But the reality is, I'll illustrate it this way. In the 1960s, there was this little TV show, I don't know if you remember, called Star Trek, okay? Star Trek was a show that was informed by secularization. And the idea was, in the future, when we're jumping around stars and visiting them and visiting green people and whatever, there will be no spirituality. So in that show, in the original Captain Kirk Star Trek, there's no religion. Because it's like, of course, we're all going to move on from that. The deeper we delve into science, the more we're going to move on from that. In the late 80s, early 90s version, the next generation, with Picard, what do you find? People on the ship are spiritual. Half the people they go visit are religious. Why? Because in that 30-year period, what we realized was, actually, the deeper that science is delving in, religion's not going anywhere. In fact, religion is flourishing. Robust Orthodox religion is flourishing all over the world, because the deeper we delve into science and history and philosophy, the more reason starts to show itself to actually believe in God. But the reality is there are people who push back against this, and they say, no, we can't believe in God. And what we've got to realize is the reason they do that isn't necessarily just because of the evidence. It's because they've had a full philosophical decision to make around what they want to believe in. They look at the data, and here's the scary part, they've already decided certain things. And so they push the data away and say, I'd rather believe this. For instance, Harvard biologist Richard Lewontin, New York Times years ago, he was doing a study and he wrote these words. We have a prior commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material or atheistic explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And so literally what he's saying, notice, he's saying, I'm not going to let a divine foot in the door, not based on facts, but on philosophy. Right? I have decided already that we're not going to do anything but a materialistic version of science, ergo, I'm not going to let any kind of conclusion in like that. These are science recognitions of faith commitments that they actually have. Because if you go back Copernicus in the 1500s, he was pushing up against scientific conclusions. So science had already established the sun revolves around the earth. Copernicus came, no, it's actually not the case. Actually, the earth revolves around the sun. He challenged what science had already concluded and for thousands of years, and they pushed back and said, we don't want to hear about the Copernicus revolution, right? When the Big Bang started to be explored by different philosophers, different scientists, it was the religious community was like, great, all of creation came into existence in a single moment. Because here's the philosophy of the Big Bang. All light, matter, time, energy came into existence in a single moment 15 billion years ago. We know because we see all the planets and everything retracting or moving out. And if you retract it backward, you realize it was 15 billion years ago. Everything that begins to exist, we know has a cause. The universe began to exist, ergo the universe has to have a cause. The religious community is like, yeah, that fits into Genesis 1. We're set, we're golden, everything began to exist. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Boom, that's beautiful. And people pushed back against it because they said the Big Bang reeked of religion. And so the reality is there's all these faith commitments already, and the reason is that they actually push back against it, and we know that. Right? We know from a rational standpoint, a couple of years ago, I heard a big bang in my house in the middle of the night. I had an alarm, and I heard a crash downstairs. I'm like, I woke up at 2 a.m. I'm like, oh no, the alarm's not working, what's going on? And I was like, okay, what was that? And I woke my wife up because I wanted her to go down and deal with the robber. And she's like, what are you doing? I'm like, there's a robber downstairs, go, go, go. And she's like, you go, fool. I'm like, right? So I go down, creeping around. What's down there? She goes, don't worry about it. It's nothing. Well, hold on a sec. We know that if something bangs and crashes, it could be something falling off. It could be a creak in the house, whatever. But we know it's not nothing. Saying a big, massive crash bang is nothing is irrational and dumb. And so we want to follow the evidence. We want to be honest with the evidence. If all space, time, matter, energy comes into existence at a single moment, we know that something had to pre-exist it. We know that. Saying it's nothing, saying nobody times nothing equals everything is not a rational way that I want to live my life. Is it one that you want to live yours on? This is why people have begun to realize, man, 100 years, the science has started to crack open the concept of God. Look at DNA strands, or you look at DNA, where Darwin was looking into these things, there was no such thing as DNA. Then we cracked the double helix and we realized that, oh my goodness, there's actually a language written in every single celled amoeba, has like an encyclopedia of language in it that's rational. And all of that means there's a mind behind it. That's what the evidence points to the point where there's actually a whole theory on how that's possible without God. It's called panspermia, and it actually talks about the idea. If you go watch the opening scene of that movie Prometheus, which confused all of you if you saw it, it's like aliens messing around with something and putting stuff in water. That's the theory on how you could possibly have DNA, have language that's rational in it without God. And what's the theory? It's that aliens put DNA into Earth and let it evolve over time. That's how we have a language, because a mind had to create it. Of course, it forces the question, well, then who created the aliens? And we're back into the cycle, all right? Even if it was the aliens, who created them? Who created them? This is why reason and rationale actually points toward God, not away from him. Here's a third thing you got to realize, that there is a difference between operational science and origin science. Operational science is the kind of thing where you look at present regularities and you can test them and put them through the scientific method, but origin science is different. It's the kind of science where you have to go back and say, this was a singular event that we can't repeat, we can't put it through a test tube, and so what do we do with it? And that's where Christianity goes, there was an event a long time ago, creation, and we're trying to figure out how it all works now, and there are better ideas around the theistic explanation than around the non-theistic explanation when it comes to origin science, because most modern science is just saying, I don't know what the origin of that thing could possibly be. And so you look at like present regularities, operational science, where you put it through a test tube, you observe it, you repeat, you do the same thing. water turns into ice. I remember in school, I did my science teacher was like, do a science experiment and show us some science. So I was like, okay. So I took a cup of water and a cup of no water, and I took a paper towel and I rolled it up. This was like my grade 6 science experiment. And I put it in and I put it there and I let the water climb up the paper towel and drip down into like the empty, it was like, I thought I was Francis Bacon at this point. And the water's just dripping in, and it's like, look at me. Right? That's observational, repeatable science. But origin science is different, where it's more like forensic science, where you've got to arrive at a murder scene and work backward and figure out what happened, right? And sometimes what happens is we've got to understand that kind of forensic science is pointing scientists back over and over again to, hey, look, it seems like someone created this universe. It seemed like someone put DNA inside people. It seems like someone designed creation to function this way. And for science to say, no, we will reject all supernatural explanations, even if the evidence points there, is like saying, it's like arriving at a murder scene and saying, okay, we're going to look at all the evidence, except let's take off the table the idea that the husband did it. Well, but the evidence is pointing he was around, his DNA is all. No, you know what? Let's try to solve this case without the obvious explanation. To a priori decide there's no supernatural or spiritual explanation for the universe the way it is actually to eliminate the evidence. And this is why Christianity and theism has always said, I want to follow the reason, like Paul says in Romans. I actually want to follow the reason. Now, there's other problems, of course. One scientist, Stephen Jay Gould, said, science is limited to physics. Science deals with the world of observable science, of observable things, the soil, the tree, the things that we can touch and taste and smell and put through. But he always said, and he was an evolutionary biologist, he said, asking and answering the question of God is outside our realm. He called it the NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria. And what he said is, we're in the realm of physics. The question of God is the question of metaphysics. It's the question that we can't answer. It's outside our pay grade. And he says, I'm telling you for the umpteenth time, science as itself cannot adjudicate the question of the existence of God. It's just there's different categories. You can't tell about the spiritual realm by simply looking at physical evidence and deducing that God doesn't exist. It's impossible. You can say that there's things that point to his existence, but not to his non-existence. And so what we've got to begin to realize over and over and over again is that whether it's biology or cosmology, it's pointing to the existence of God again and again and again, to the point where one scientist, Alan Rex Sandage, said to be the greatest observational cosmologist of all time, said this, "It is my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science." Alistair McGrath said this, "The idea that science and religion are in perpetual conflict is no longer taken seriously by any major historian of science. One of the last remaining bastions of atheism survives only at the popular level, namely the myth that an atheistic fact-based science is permanently at war with a faith-based religion." It's not the case. And as we realize, when we study evolution next week, we're going to realize that even that entire worldview is based on the assumption that things transitioned. But then we look at the fossil record and we see no transitional fossils. And so we as people, you and me together, we have to ask the question, will I trust the idea that God exists? Will I trust in the person and the work of Jesus? Because the science points there, the history points there, the philosophy points there. The idea that you know the difference between right and wrong. You know that racism is wrong. You know that murder is wrong. How did you ever get to that conclusion? The only way is by having it built into you by a moral lawgiver. You have a moral law. The very fact that you have a moral law cries out for a moral lawgiver. I remember we were down in Seattle a couple years ago, and there was this dinosaur that my kids wanted to crawl up on, and there was a lady in line, and they were trying to get in line. And my girls got up there, and then her girls started to crawl up there. My wife's like, "Hey, get your kids off that dinosaur." And the girl's like, you butted in line. She's like, "What? I butted in line? I didn't butt in line." And me and the husband are kind of looking at each other like, "What's up?" Right? And the ladies are like, "Meh," and they're just going at each other based on what premise? That cutting in line is wrong. Right? I mean, we're all at the grocery store with our masks on, all right? And there's like plots on the ground where you're supposed to stand and not stand. Imagine you're standing in line at the grocery store and someone just cuts and takes your little circle, and you'd be like, dude, that's wrong. Well, where did you ever get the deduction between right and wrong? The very fact that you're putting that person on trial says, okay, there's a moral law, which means there's a moral lawgiver. If there's no moral lawgiver, if there's no moral law, there's no moral lawgiver. Ergo, God wouldn't exist. But the fact that things bother you, the fact that you believe in evil, the fact that you look at the destruction of the environment or the hurting of other people and people groups, the fact that you feel that, like at a soul level, says that at a soul level, you have a morality that transcends nature. Because if all you were was a product of nature, none of that stuff would bug you, because your moral compass would just be programmed after hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary development, and you would just say, this is nature red in tooth and claw, baby. This is the way things happen. People have to die. It doesn't matter as long as me and my tribe survive. But you don't believe that. You'd go in after a stranger and maybe risk your life to save them. Why? Nothing in nature can tell you, because your morality transcends nature. And so if we're honest with one another, if you're watching this, you're not a Christian, and you're comparing ideas one versus the other, reason or faith, I would say it's faith informed by beautiful reason. History, philosophy, science, over and over and over. And you don't have to abandon that in order to believe in this Jesus, who actually is one of the great reasons to believe at all. Because all the historians outside the Bible say Jesus Christ existed. Many historians, secular, trust the Bible is legitimate. And they say this book is incredible, the way that it presents Jesus. And it's how it unfolds the death and the resurrection of Jesus is the way it happened. And so the question is, do you want to follow the evidence, or do you want to keep denying it, just shucking it off and saying, let's just stay out of my life? And if you're going to do that, at least be honest with yourself and ask the question, what's the reason behind the reason? Is it because you're actually following the evidence, or is it because you want to hold on to your own autonomy, your own authority? Maybe you're scared of what your coworkers, your family, your friends might say if you decide to give your life to Jesus. Don't let fear or your feeling or a hodgepodge worldview that you put together by just sitting dreaming at night, whatever, eating pizza, and now you feel this way about that and that. You got to inform everything you do by facts, not already predetermined philosophy or how you feel in a particular moment. And you face facts, and you come face to face with the historical person and work of Jesus, who says, what are you going to do now with what I have done, my death, my resurrection on your behalf? Which historians go, this actually makes sense that this happened. This is why these guys died for it. What are you going to do with the confrontation that the person of Jesus brings into your life? Let me pray for us. Lord, thank you that we do not have to choose between reason and faith. You have given us minds. You tell us to follow you with our whole heart, soul, strength, and mind, to use our brains and study in order to learn about you, run the ramp of reason, and then take the leap of faith and inform our life with the Bible and what it says about you and Jesus and everything you have for our lives to flourish. Let us repent of our own fears. Burn away the fear and give us courage to believe. Everyone watching this, everyone part of this amazing church, Connexus Church, let them form community around the people who right now are going to give their life to Jesus and overcome this false dichotomy, this mythological narrative that's been kind of fed them over and over, almost by osmosis, that to believe is to abandon reason. Lord, let them transcend that and realize that it's false over and over again, but you want to confront them. You want to actually see them come to know you, Jesus. Do that work among this great people. In your name we pray. Amen. Guys, thank you so much for being part of this.